Hi everyone! The Harlequin Crest is probably the most sought after chase item in the entire game right now. This is useful for almost every single build, for almost every single class. And today I want to take a deeper look at how useful is it exactly, actually, especially for rogues. I went back to actually do some math on Harlequin Crest to check how good it is. So I went through this for almost 2 hours or so yesterday on stream, and I figured I should share my results a little bit. So when you have a Shako equipped compared to a normal helm, you will have two problems. Number one is that you give up armor on your normal helm. You see here my helm is a 925, it has 21.8% armor roll, kind of a low roll actually, and also has 2 resistance rolls. So as a rogue or as a bard, and even on some other classes and some other builds, you usually have some resistances on your gear. So usually that means like triple res on the boots and then like 1 or 2 on the helm, because you have kind of the lowest opportunity cost here. And typically your chest is reserved for, 4 out of 4 defensive stats, usually depends too, unless you run Theobald's Will like the rogues do right now. And this means that if I want to equip this helm, my resistances are going to be absolutely trash. I have 2 uncapped resistances by a mile, and even if I try to make up for this with my gems, for example in jewelry, I would have to put like 1 here and 1 here, and then I would still be 5% off. So you probably have to put in, for example, a diamond as well, and actually give up 750 armor. And well, if you have been paying attention lately, armor is pretty important when you want to do high-end content, especially in Abattoir of Zir, where you have like the strongest monsters in the entire game, and we expect to have a requirement of roughly up to 14k armor or so to actually be capped. And reaching the armor cap is extremely important for its survivability. You can go check out my other video if you want to see more details on that. So this means that usually equipping the Shako puts you in a tough spot when it comes to both fixing your armor and fixing your resists. And having both of these capped is going to be like the absolute minimum requirement in order to survive. So here, as I mentioned, I could try to do this, for example, with the gems. I could barely reach this armor, this resistance cap here, but it's only possible because of my build, which is actually like somewhat special in that regard. As a rogue, for example, there is like some all-res here, and then there is a bit of extra all-res on the Lyrana's Instinct board. This is basically what a lot of builds pick up right now, because you can buff the control glyph there to the maximum. And then I also have the Cunning Stratagem board, where I have another all-res cluster here. So there are some more small nodes I could pick up, so I could try to shift around a few points and at least make it so I don't need to like waste a third gem, only like 1 and 1, but then we would be barely capped. And then there's stuff like resistance breakers in the game, for example. So apparently Abattoir of Zir is going to have resistance breakers, or like any other Nightmare Dungeon mod, it seems. And this means that if you are just barely capped and then you ever run into resistance breakers, you're gonna instantly die. And I don't really like dying on hardcore. So in that case, it's definitely not a bad idea to overcap a little bit at least, so that you are still somewhat protected, because those affixes are apparently going to be hidden. So you can actually run through resistance breakers and don't even know about it. So I don't really like the idea of that. And this means that I kind of want to make up for those resistances with an extra roll that is like at least 40-50% or so, similar to what I have here on the helm. And this means that usually equipping a Shako means you have to drop 2 defensive mods from your chest or from your pants if you wear normal pants, and then put resistances there. And that means that usually you have the best, like 4 out of 4 chests would be armor, damage reduction, and then, for example, close and distant, or close and poisoned, or on other classes, close and bleeding, or whatever. But usually you have armor and damage reduction, like the flat damage reduction being like the best 2 mods. And then the other 2 would be the resistances. And if you give up something like 15 to 20% damage reduction from 2 separate conditional effects. This is kind of like what you're dealing with if you do this. And this means that you kind of lose a really huge advantage that this Shako already brings, on top of having this armor problem. In this case, for example, I can be armor capped, as you can see here, just standing in town. I have 14.1k armor, and I'm fine. I'm going to be capped against everything. There is armor breakers in the game, but realistically, I would probably not really try to play too much around armor breakers. I did talk about resistance breakers, which is, yeah, probably, kind of a similar story. It's not going to be like that common, I imagine, but it can definitely make you fail more runs. And if you can be overcapped on resistances, I would definitely like to try, but for armor it's a bit of a more difficult story. In this case, I can be armor capped without the use of the disobedience aspect, and that is actually a really huge advantage. So I will always have my 85% damage reduction no matter what, unless I run into armor breakers. And this means that when enemy surprises me, or when I get crowd controlled, or when there's something unexpected happening, I will always have my armor cap. And this is actually pretty important, because for example, if you go into Abattoir of Zir and let's say you have like 10k base armor, and then you have disobedience aspect in your gear, then, you know, you can just get blasted off screen from a crossbow and, well, you take triple the damage, you're gonna be instantly dead, and this is it for the run. So in that case, having this consistent capped armor is really huge advantage, I think, especially for builds that don't have such an easy time stacking disobedience at all times, you know, even from off screen or something like that. Some builds can do that. There is some technologies, you know, like Barbs with Hemomancy and Berserk Ripping, for example, have a pretty easy time. But on many rogue builds, for example, you have to go in melee or close to melee, or even for range builds like this Pensional build here, for example, it may not be so easy to actually stack it up ahead of time before you start taking damage. And this means you have like a really high chance of just dying. So this is like another factor that comes into play here. And in this case, for example, when I equip the Shako, I would first of all give up 2 rolls, and then I would have to add disobedience aspect because I'm clearly far away from the cap. There is a second solution here. In this case, for example, I am pretty close to the cap with 12.5k because I actually have, you know, really high armor investment already. There would be a way to do this, for example, with consumables, like with the Iron Skin Elixir. So that one could kind of solve that issue where we get plus 900 base armor and then we have like 2 armor rolls. So it's like 1500 or so. So we're going to be back to roughly this 14k, but then you also give up your consumable slot for this. And there are a lot of other really good consumables in the game that are also worth considering. You know, there's cruelty elixirs. There is like these, you know, man-slaying elixir, beast-slaying elixir. You can actually pop those in Abattoir Of Zir, for example, to try to get an advantage. Or if you don't have anything else, you can always just go with a fortitude elixir, which is also a pretty massive toughness boost. In fact, this fortitude elixir gives you more than, for example, this life roll does on the Harlequin Crest. So while you do get, for example, this extra life advantage on the Harlequin Crest, I can just as well not run the Iron Skin Elixir and run Fortitude instead and actually have even more life. So this is kind of the consideration here. So with all that being said, let's go into the actual calculations that I've done here. So we have the Shako. When we equip it, we get 20% damage reduction, but this is effectively the same as a Might aspect. So at least for rogue builds, you're going to have Might aspect or you have this, and it's, you know, Might is always up basically with a comb point build. So if you get crowd control for 6 seconds, you're going to have some other issues anyway. So this is basically the same. We get 11% life, plus minus, depending on how much life you have. In my case, it's not that much we get from the Shako because we have Doombringer equipped here. But if you don't have Doombringer, for example, Shako has a bit of a bigger impact. Could be up to like 15% or so. Your mileage may vary a little bit. You get a resource roll on the Shako, pretty useless for rogues, can be good for other builds, and potentially for the Abattoir Of Zir stuff. However, I'm going to go into that later in this video actually. Then we have 10% cooldown, which is somewhat helpful on rogue builds, for example, but not really all too much here. We get slightly faster imbuements, slightly more agility skills, but it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. It totals out for like a total of 25% cooldown reduction for dash, because you also get the skill ranks. So that is kind of neat, but ultimately not too impactful, I think, in Abattoir Of Zir. We have all stats on it, so there's a bunch of minor stuff. And now comes the aspect changes and the roll changes. So I averaged the 2 damage reduction rolls that we lose from the chest to roughly 18% damage reduction. So when we have our like green chest, for example, armor, damage reduction, close distance. Yeah, if you have like some kind of like high-end roll or pretty close to high-end, you can have close and distance, something like around 18 to 20% damage reduction against everything, basically. So one gives you against close, one against distant. They're both like, let's say 20% or 18% or so. We have to remove those 2 for 2 res rolls. So it's like an overall 18% damage reduction loss. And also Umber's aspect. In the case of a pen shot build, for example, you have this aspect here, which with the full stacks gives you 40% damage reduction against one hit, and then 32 against the next, and then 24 against the next, etc. So I averaged it out to 20% damage reduction, which depends a little bit on the fight. In this case, for example, with the pensional build, we would actually fully stack Umber's aspect to 5 stacks on every single shot. So you probably have a kind of like an expected higher average than what I chose here for the calculations. So basically I averaged it out to 2.5 stacks up on average. But realistically, you probably have more up. However, in some cases, you might not really have any up. If you take many small hits at once, it was kind of hard to find like the good solution here, so I just did the average. Then the Shako gives us roughly 21% DPS. That comes straight up from the skill ranks. We go from rank 9 to rank 13, so we do 230% damage instead of 190. So this is the 21% damage upgrade here. However, only applies to attacks and not to X-File procs, which actually do have quite an impact here on this build, for example. So I guess an overall DPS gain of like, let's say 15% from wearing the Shako with the +4 to all skills. And then, yeah, we have to run Disobedience. So we drop one of the aspects, which is the Umbers, and we keep the cheats. So in this case, yeah, we keep this here. We put Disobedience probably on the amulet. I guess you could move it around, for example, putting cheats on the amulet and then having like Disobedience there. So that depends a little bit on the build. And we can also shift 3 passive points, removing Dark Shroud, adding Rug, kind of like a minor thing. So I didn't really actually calculate this here. So basically what it comes out to be is that Shako just overall gives me way less damage reduction because of this shift in the mods on the chest and on, for example, the legendary aspects. And you see this here. So EHP multiplied, this means effective hit points. This basically just means we take 1 as our, baseline survivability with a normal helm equipped, and then I started making adjustments. So for example, 1, we get 11% life, so I did like times 1.11. And then, for example, we lose 18% damage reduction here from those 2 mods on the chest. So in that case, you would do times 0.82, and then we will lose the Umbrus, so this is like a times 0.8. And this is kind of like how I made that calculation here. So it's exactly this value here. This is like EHP multiplier with cheats aspect up. So in case you actually slow enemies, in case you don't know what cheats does, it gives you a damage reduction from crowd controlled enemies. So many rogue builds rely on slow, for example, to like either proc this or proc some other stuff. So this is, kind of just like how much protection you have with this aspect and then without, and then also without disobedience, for example. So you have these different values here, and you see that you are extremely squishy when you don't have your conditional effects up compared to normal. And in this case with disobedience, I just said that you're gonna get roughly like 50% damage reduction or so. That also depends a little bit on like how much armor do you have exactly. But in this case, for example, if I run around with like, like say it's 12k armor instead of 14k armor, yeah, it should be something like around double damage taken or so from physical attacks. So if there's a crossbow sitting in the corner surprising you and you don't have any stacks up, you're gonna get absolutely annihilated. This is basically what it says here. So we take roughly quadruple damage if disobedience is down and cheats is not up, versus, for example, only like half the damage or so when only cheats is not up and we don't have to worry about disobedience. And you see here that in general, Shako just kind of loses out on the EHP, like on a total like survivability ranking basically for the Pen and RF build. And it's kind of the same story when you try to change it a little bit. However, it's a bit more in favor of Shako when we go back and, for example, we put res gems in our jewelry. So we could remove, this and then have like res gems. It would have even less armor. Now we're looking at 11k armor, for example, in this setup here, instead of like around 12k. So we are still way further away. And this means that when we rely on this obedience aspect to trigger our armor, we have even less protection when disobedience is down, basically. So now, for example, instead of taking double damage when disobedience is down, maybe now it's like roughly triple damage or so. So this means that when you ever get surprised by something and you don't have disobedience up, you're going to be even squishier. But on the other hand, you could try to make this work, for example, on this build by just putting like 2 gems here for the resistances and then keeping your normal chest with the 4 out of 4 damage reduction stats. And this is basically this calculation here. So you see here, the total outcome is still roughly a loss of 11.2% EHP, which is not too bad. But you have the problem that, for example, the resistance breakers I mentioned earlier, they are still gonna shred you basically if you ever run into those. And it's, as I mentioned also, like you need a bit of extra investment in those resistances. At least you're on the rogue. I cannot make this work without actually putting more passive points on the paragons to try to get more resistances and actually cap out. So there is also like some other slight disadvantages there that I didn't actually add into these calculations. And then we have like, again, the numbers here. So when the temporary effects are down, like cheats or disobedience aspects, you are extremely squishy basically. And then finally, we have the calculation here on the bottom with Iron Skin Elixir. So for example, we have Shako equipped and we keep our skull gems here. So like this, we could actually hit armor cap with just popping the Iron Skin Elixir that I showed off earlier. So it's this plus 900 armor elixir, and maybe you can also use an incense. There's one that gives you 200 armor, but again, they're kind of like limited, so you will run out of these eventually. I found a ton of Helltide. I have 41 of these elixirs here, which is a good number, but if you really want to go hard in the Abattoir of Zir, you will have to chuck these like all the time basically, and eventually you're gonna run out. And I've farmed hundreds of durials basically at this point, and this is the amount of Iron Skin Elixirs that I got. So it's not really such a crazy amount, and you can try to buy them from other people, but it's kind of tough to rely on them, to be honest. But either way, let's say you do that, the calculation is here. So this means that we can skip the disobedience aspect in this under some circumstances. So I would not have to replace the defensive aspect. We would only replace the might aspect here, the 20% damage reduction, for the other 20% damage reduction. We keep this, and everything is fine. In that case, it's actually pretty close. So 0.85. However, you also want to compare this to another setup, for example, where we use another defensive elixir. So, for example, if I use my normal helm and I have my armor cap, I don't need to use an iron skin elixir, so we can use the fortitude elixir that I mentioned earlier. And in that case, we also gain roughly 17% EHP on that normal helm setup. So this is kind of like why Shako turns out to be still a roughly 15% EHP loss. And then we have kind of similar numbers here again with like without the temporary effects like disobedience or cheats or something like that. So you still see here that there is this disadvantage for the Shako basically. Now I did also do some calculations for the second rogue build here, the Twisting Blades. So I think Twisting Blades and Penshot, they're going to be the top 2 rogue builds. So my main build is going to be Pen RF, at least for the start, and we'll see if we're going to switch it later. And of course, Twisting Blades is probably going to be like probably even more popular than that. And I did some calculations here, and basically it turns out that because you don't use Umber's aspect on Twisting Blades, there is definitely a bigger advantage for Shako here. And also I think resources are a bit more important on Twisting Blades than they are on Penshot, but realistically resources don't really matter on a core point build. But if you look at this here, there are a few different aspects. So if you look at the planner, we have cheats here, and then an escape artist aspect and the might aspect. And then when we do Uberneaks, we have the Shako, we have the disobedience and the cheats. So we drop the might, we drop the escape artist, and we get disobedience and Shako. So this is the same as the might again. And here we drop escape artist, which doesn't actually add any EHP, but I think it's actually a really useful aspect here that actually allows you to stay alive much more easily under certain circumstances. I will explain more of this in the actual Twisting Blades guide, but it's actually a pretty powerful defensive aspect, I believe. But it's kind of hard to quantify it in numbers. But what it means is that Shako versus normal helm is actually pretty close. We're looking at roughly a 9% EHP loss here, equipping the Shako. So that's not really all too much. However, again, if you rely on disobedience, you have this problem that, you know, you are a melee build as a Twisting Blades rogue, and it's really hard to pre-stack disobedience before going into the fray. And then you can just walk in, and even though you have like a lot of crowd controls with like, you know, smoke grenade, for example, is in the build. I also put concealment there, and okay, you have poison ticks and stuff, but if you engage a fresh pack and it is like a really large pack, for example, you can smoke grenade a few guys and you can walk up to them, something will hit you. There's like almost no way around that before you ever get your disobedience stacks up. So it's kind of like one of those cases again where I don't really want to rely on this aspect to try to get my armor values that I need. So in this case, I gave it like a huge penalty here. We have only 40% DR. Again, this is kind of like a ballpark number. Depends plus minus on how much armor you have and, you know, the exact calculations. So it's just like kind of a guesstimate. So you take, you know, 2.5 times the damage is the calculation here if disobedience is down, and then if your cheats is also down, which is also like a bit harder to proc on this build compared to Penshot. Penshot just slows everything, so it's very easy to get this cheats aspect up. But in the case of like a Twisting Blades build, you actually have to rely mostly on this lucky hit chance to slow and the puncture, and then you have to spread with shared misery, and this is how you apply your cheats aspect for the most part. So it takes a bit longer, it can't be done at range, and in general you are going to be way squishier when you engage a fight. So this is kind of like the calculation here for Twisting Blades. So it is relatively close. Still, you have this problem, you have to fix your resistances. And on Twisting Blades, you also don't get around changing your values on your chest. Like on the Twisting Blades build, you have simply less resistances. You cannot make up for it with just the gems on your jewelry. This is kind of like a specialty of Penshot, for example, where we have the Cunning Strider gem board, and there are more resistance rolls or more resistance nodes available on the Paragon. But on Twisting Blades, this is not possible. You have to have those 2 rolls on the chest instead of on the helm, and then the 3 on the boots, basically. So this is kind of like how that goes, and there's like no way around it. So you lose this damage reduction on the chest. And of course, as I mentioned, the escape artist aspect. So just to go into this real quick, escape artists, when you take damage once, you trigger a smoke grenade automatically and you dodge the next 7 attacks guaranteed. And this is why I actually put this in a build, because this exactly allows you to kind of like safely engage a pack, and even if something hits you before you crowd control them, or you know, you throw your smoke grenade in there and another few guys are not crowd controlled, you actually have the time to like do your thing and start getting more crowd controls up on everything. Or for example, when crowd controls drop because monsters become unstoppable, you suddenly just dodge the next 7 attacks for up to 10 seconds. And this can trigger every 45 seconds. For a melee build like Twisting Blades that has a lot of crowd control, I think this is an extremely strong aspect, and it's going to be very useful in Abattoir of Zir. So this is why I put it in the build, and this is not reflected at all in this calculation here. So you lose roughly 9% EHP and you lose Escape Artist. So this is kind of important to consider here. Now, finally, let's talk about a Selig build. So I made 2 calculations for this. Looks like this here. So first we have a Twisting Blades Selig build with life-based, and we have a Twisting Blades low-life build. So you might have seen some of these. I also made another video talking about this with my Barbarian, for example, like 2 weeks ago or something like that. There was a lot of like, hype around this amulet and all that, and people tried to make it work. It seems like a really good amulet for barbs and for Zorks based on some of the interactions. However, I think for rogues, there's simply not really a good way to integrate it into any build. Basically, what happens is you equip the Melted Heart of Selig, well, you give up your entire amulet slot. And this thing doesn't really have anything of value on its own besides the resource generation and then the effect. And the resource generation is effectively only there to fuel this amulet itself. It doesn't really help you with anything else. So you get 30% maximum resource, you get 20 maximum resource from Tibalt's Will. So you have a total energy pool of 150. You can extend that a bit further, but compared to other classes, not that much. 150 energy is kind of like the expected value here. You could maybe have like a ring roll or something, but this kind of details at this point. So we just go with 150 maximum energy. And then you have all stats. Okay, it's like a minor thing. Core skill, literally useless on poison builds, and damage by healthy is extremely minor as well. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. Versus, let's say, another amulet here that is like extremely defensive. For example, here you can have, first of all, the armor roll that helps you to hit those armor caps. And then you can have damage reduction, damage reduction, damage reduction. You see there's a lot of extra EHP here in this amulet. Like if you actually look at this amulet, if you combine all of these effects together, you actually take like less than half damage or something like that. And this doesn't even count the armor value. So not only do you have to make up for the armor, but you also lose all this damage reduction and you lose a defensive aspect. And this means that in most cases, your HP goes way down when you use a Selig build. So on a life-based builds, you can see this here. This is like basically all the calculation. So no cheats aspect, no damage reduction, no poison, no close. You don't have the armor. This means your total EHP goes down by 63%. You have roughly only a third of the previous effective hit points when you equip Melted Heart of Selig. And then you get something back. So in this case, we have 150 energy, which equals basically 50% extra life. So, you have 100% life and then you have 150 energy. It's free energy per 1% life. So this is where that comes from. So our EHP goes back up to roughly 0.56 multiplier. So this means our total EHP by equipping this amulet is roughly halved. So that's basically what we're talking about. Or even when cheats is down, like the 37% damage reduction here, it's still slightly less. So even if you don't apply the cheats aspect to a target, you still have less total like of a life pool when you have the Melted Heart of Selig equipped. And then, of course, you also have to run Disobedience, because when you have, for example, Melted Heart and Shako equipped, there's like literally no way around Disobedience aspect, even with Iron Skin Elixir. And usually you want to combine the Melted Heart of Selig with a Shako so that they also profit from this extra resource generation here. So this is kind of like, a really big deal for Melted Heart of Selig builds. So in this case, you have really low EHP on a life build. Now we can talk about low life builds as well. So I have the calculations here. In this case, you can swap around a few things and play low life. The way this usually works is that you use the Vampiric Power, Resilience. So for example, on a Twisting Blades build, you're going to replace Undying, you're going to put in Resilience. It's kind of like a, this for that. Since obviously you cannot run any healing on a low life build, you drop this and you also have to drop the Doombringer, because Doombringer has a heal proc. So let's say you have access to the Doombringer, you have to remove this. And in this case, you get +1 offensive power, I guess, and a bit better stats, or you get something like X-Files Ring. So that depends a little bit on the build. I think on the Twisting Blades build, actually there's no X-Files Ring when you have Doombringer, but then you kind of bring back the X-Files Ring in this case when you don't equip the Doombringer. But either way, the calculation goes like this. We put damage reduction while injured on the boots. We get 43% damage reduction. This is the maximum roll. So on the boots, there's this mod. It also exists on the pants. However, Tibalt's Will is a requirement, so you cannot do that. Then we lose the damage reduction on the chest. This is for extra res that we free up from the boot slot. So you have triple res here. You have to remove something here to get that res. Then we get the resilience power and just calculate this as 48% damage reduction. Let's say that you are really, really close to dying, basically. You can get, up to 50% damage reduction. So if you go to 4% HP, then you have the 48% damage reduction multiplier. We lose the Doombringer. That is 38.5% EHP, at least on my setup. You gain a slightly better weapon. Yeah, okay, here I actually added Umbral aspect. So I didn't add X-Files. I added Umbral aspect because you actually need to fuel the Selig. somehow. You can do this with other aspects, so there are a few options here. So there's the Umbral, that's like a really powerful resource mod here, especially on Twisting Blades. You have tons of crowd control, you're gonna proc a lot of this. So that's kind of like just for recovery. You can also do assimilation. So this is like some people have tried where you kind of like just get this passive extra resource income, which can be quite nice. You also get 8% dodge, so it does have a bit of an upside there as well. But I don't think it's actually as good as something like Umbral. It will be good in very large pools, but you actually have to be able to even survive those very large pools, and you can't really stack that much dodge to just kind of like stand there and tank everything, I believe. And another option is also the energizing aspect. It's also something I tested. So since you have very high attack speed and you hit 3 times with your puncture, you can get actually 27 energy every time you shoot, and then multiply it by all of those effects. I actually tried a setup where I got something like, I think 50 or 60 energy per puncture. So I was able to get like, you know, upwards of like 100, 150 energy per second, just kind of like shooting into elites. And I still didn't like it, honestly. But either way, there are some options to actually get a big energy recovery, and you probably want to include one of them. So that's what I did here. And well, with all of those numbers in there, our total EHP is definitely looking a bit better in the case of compared to this life build here. So you see here, there's only like roughly a 25% loss compared to, you know, normal build without Selig, without anything. In this case, if you play a low life build, your entire life pool is your energy. You don't have actual life to spend, you only have energy to spend. And in this case, your EHP actually goes below what the life build can do. And you can see this here. So again, we have 150 total energy. We have, you know, this total energy basically is the equivalent of half of our life. But now we don't have any life because we're going to be at 1% life permanently, staying at low life. And this means that our total EHP is actually 0.33 compared to, you know, the regular 1. And this means it goes down by like 62%, which is actually less than the life build here. So if you want to play a Selig rogue build, you should probably play this with a life build and not with a low life build, which also has some other advantages because you don't have to actually go to low life. And, you know, it's kind of like difficult to set this up sometimes. And for example, if you go in Abattoir of Zir and it heals you up at the start of the run, you have to actually spend like some time at the start of the run to go to low life. And you can't really use any recovery mechanics. You can't use potions that also help you out to actually kind of like recover all this life, or this entire like EHP pool basically. However, if you have insane resource recovery, then this is not really such a problem. But either way, if you are trying to survive really big hits or really big burst damage of incoming damage, your EHP is extremely low on this setup. So while you can have insane recovery, and let's say you constantly fill up your energy pool between every single hit you take, it could be pretty useful, but you still can't survive the biggest hits in the game. So compared to, for example, barbs that are just like tanky boys by default, or swords as well, where you can also have barriers, for example, it's just extremely difficult on a rogue to even survive the big one-shots in the game. For example, I tried this on my rogue. I went into a T100, I tried to get hit by a lightning storm, for example, and I was not able to survive the lightning storm. I was not even close to surviving the lightning storm with this low life build. Instead, I also had to have 5 stacks of dark shot up, which gave me like 50% damage reduction on top of all the other stuff. And then I was able to take a lightning storm hit, and it still actually did some damage to my life through the entire energy bar. And on top of this, rogues don't really have this like kind of like infinite energy recovery loop, like for example barbs with the fury and the sorgs with the chain lightning tech. So all you have is the assimilation aspect. Yeah, assimilation aspect is not really as reliable and not really as strong as some of the others, I think. So it just doesn't really work out in my opinion. So while there are definitely, you know, some possibilities to run a Selig build, I think it's just effectively worse than a normal option. Like a normal amulet is just better because you have an extra defensive aspect, because you can have up to 3 defensive stats, and you can have armor on it. And offensively, you don't really lose anything from not running Selig. Selig is like a really poor amulet offensively. So it just doesn't really give you anything besides defense. So you can just well run a full defense amulet. That's kind of the conclusion here. So to sum this all up here, first the Shako and then the Selig. In my case, I think Shako is a good item, even for rogues, even for combo point rogues, even for pen RF. Shako is not bad. I was actually very happy when I found one, because this is kind of like the one item I was after I got the Doombringer, and we finally got it. Yeah, with this EHP going down a lot, and with like, you know, relying on disobedience aspect, you know, it's like less consistent. or like some stuff like you have to give up the escape artist aspect on the Twisting Blades build. In general, you really have to consider what do you gain and what do you lose from using the Harlequin crest. So that's kind of like the point I wanted to get across here. And in most cases, it will mean that you are going to be squishier, especially on the armor side of things for physical damage. And you do gain a bit of extra damage from those extra all skill ranks. Now, this may be different for other classes or for other builds. I can totally see that, you know, this is like an insane helm on like any barb build and, you know, like most sword builds or so, but it kind of depends a bit, again, on like how well can you actually deal with the downsides of not having resistances on your helm, of not having armor on your helm, and how can you make up for those like downsides, basically. And in the case of Abattoir of Zir, very good item, but only for Sorks and Barbs, it seems. I've not seen anyone really make it like a good thing on any of the other 3 classes, including for the Rogue. I mean, we have the numbers here, they look terrible, and I don't think Selig is a thing on Rogue. So at least that's what I can say here. I don't think it's really a thing on other classes that are not Barb and Sork right now. So this is my conclusion here. And in any case, I hope this helps you to make your own decision about your uniques. As I mentioned, I have some build guides coming up for the rogues in particular. I also updated all of the Maxwell guides already for the rogues. And there is some mentions of uniques and what to do, especially in the Abattoir of Zir variants and the progression section, so you can go check it out. But usually it does require a bit of like shifting stuff around. I hope this video helps you making your own decision. Wish you good luck in the Abattoir of Zir, and I'll see you guys next time.